Welcome to the Your Innovation Coach webinar. Today's topic is part one of understanding project risk. To start with, I'll give a brief introduction, and then I want to talk about, in general, uncertainty, which is really what leads to risk in new product development. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time today, and then also in part two, on tools that can be used to manage and mitigate risk. When we think about risk in the context of new product development, there are really three primary categories that we have to consider. First is the overall risk to the business of undertaking the development in the first place, and that includes multiple factors, including the risk of market success. In other words, when we come to the market with the product, will it actually be successful? Of course, part of that is financial success, both in the short term and the long term, and even things like competitive response. How will the competitors respond to the new product? So there are several factors. I'm sure you can think of other ones specific to your business that are associated with the risk for a development. There are two other categories that really, in my opinion, are a subset of the overall risk of the business. One is technical and the other is schedule. We tend to deal with these separately, and we consider them separately, but they are really part and parcel, I think, of the overall risk of the business. Technical risk really includes things like technology. What's the risk that you will or will not be able to develop technology that's required? Product costs, both from a design standpoint and from a manufacturing standpoint. Safety and regulatory. Of course, if you're developing medical devices, that's a primary risk and really a technical risk. Product quality, again, both from a design standpoint, manufacturing standpoint, manufacturability. So again, several factors that are associated with technical risk. Then there's the risk, the schedule risk, whether you will get the project done in the time frame that's required. And kind of a part of that, really, I lump it in with the schedule risk, and that's the project cost risk, the risk that you will go over cost on the project. And that's really driven typically by the schedule. The longer a project takes, the more people have to spend time on it, and that's typically the biggest cost driver in a project. And things like resource availability, the risk that you won't really have the resources required at the time that you start the project. That's a real common problem in most companies. So anyway, these are the three primary areas that we have to consider in new product development. And we respond to that risk in a couple different ways. We attempt to manage it, which is really about understanding the risk, coping with it, trying to overcome it. And then we, secondly, try to mitigate risk. We look at individual risk factors and try to lessen the risk or moderate the risk for those. In some cases, try to eliminate it completely. So these are the ways that we typically respond. Okay, I want to have a discussion now about uncertainty. It's really uncertainty in projects that leads to risk. And so I want to talk about that in general before we start talking about tools. And there are going to be really three categories that we're going to discuss relative to uncertainty. One is, first category includes task variation plus what we call foreseeable uncertainty. And then anything that's not accounted for in these two is lumped into what we call residual risk. Secondly, I want to talk about complexity. And third is what we call unforeseeable uncertainty, or UNCs, unknown unknowns. You don't know what you don't know. A key insight here is that I think we tend, in my experience, to focus, when we talk about risk, we tend to focus on the schedule and the technical risk for a specific project. But these three categories of uncertainty we're going to talk about are really can be applied at a much more higher level, in the aspect of the overall business risk. So for instance, even if you're developing a new business model, it may not have anything to do with technical risk or schedule risk, but these uncertainties can come into play at that level. So I want you to think a little bit more broadly when we talk about these uncertainties and not relate it strictly to the technical issues and the schedule issues, but at a broader level. This is a great resource associated with risk and new product development, and I encourage you to check that out. Much of what I'm going to talk about here in the next few slides comes from this resource, as well as just my practical experience in industry in terms of new product development and managing projects. All right, let's talk about this first subset, which includes variation, foreseeable uncertainty, and residual risk. Variation really has to do with the fact that if you think about your projects, they're really a series of dependent and independent tasks. And so when we create our schedule, we look at each individual task and we try to come up with an estimate on how long those tasks are going to take. And then we add that all up, put a schedule together, look at the critical path, and come up with an overall length of the schedule. But the fact is that each task estimate has a range of outcomes. It's not a single number. For instance, we might estimate that it's going to take us 2 weeks to get a part from a vendor, but the reality is that it's going to take 2 weeks plus or minus something. And so if you think about your schedule, every task in that schedule has some normal variation associated with those estimates, and that rolls into the entire uncertainty within the project. There are a couple other comments I want to make related to this topic, and that is that really what we're talking about here in terms of uncertainty and task variation is related to the schedule risk. It's how long the project's going to take, and that's in many cases related to this task variation. The second comment is that I think sometimes we look at our schedule and we forget that when we estimate these tasks, they're really actually not truly statistical entities. There's bias in our estimates. In other words, we tend to be very optimistic about how long things are going to take. So in my experience, when we estimate a time for a task, it's much more likely that we're going to go over than we are going to go under. And I think that's, is borne out in all of our experiences running projects, is that it just seems like more often than not the projects are late rather than early. And I think that's has much to do with this concept of task variation and the fact that there's bias in our estimates. The second category here within this first group of uncertainty is what we call foreseeable uncertainty. These are events that we can anticipate and plan for. So for instance, you might believe that you're going to use a particular part in a subsystem, but you're not sure if it's going to work. So you've got a plan B. If that risk actually happens, if something happens with that part, then you got a backup plan. You got a plan B. So that's what we call foreseeable uncertainty, things that you can anticipate. And then basically whatever's not accounted for in task variation and foreseeable uncertainty ends up in what we call residual risk. So that's anything not accounted for in variation and foreseeable uncertainty. And part of that residual risk could be unknown unknowns, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. If these do not dominate the project, then basically you're left with these two types of uncertainties within the project. This type of uncertainty is really the type of risk that most project managers are really familiar with. And we use some very common tools in order to manage this risk, for instance, Gantt charts. And we deal with it in a couple different ways. In terms of task variation, we look at the critical path, we generate our Gantt charts, maybe we use the critical chain method and buffer management. So there are lots of different techniques that we are very comfortable with as project managers to manage task variation and try to understand it and cope with it and manage it. And then we use techniques like risk lists in order to manage and deal with foreseeable uncertainty. And we're going to talk about risk lists here in a little bit. The second type of project uncertainty I want to talk about is complexity. And complexity stems from a large number of parts that can interact in non-simple ways. So it really has two ingredients. It has to do with the number of parts in your system plus the number of interactions. So the implication is that you can have a very large system, but unless the parts interact with one another, it's not necessarily a complex system. So there's actually a mathematical representation of this concept. If you just look at the number of elements in a system and how and they can all theoretically interact with one another, the number of interactions, as you can see, goes up logarithmically. And I think how that plays out in projects, in my experience anyway, with electromechanical type systems that also include software within the overall system, as you increase the number of new systems within your development and then layer on top of that all new software, both embedded and upper level, that interacts with all of the subsystems, the complexity really goes up. And as the complexity goes up, in my experience, the risk on the schedule goes up. It's much more difficult to manage that. Project and product costs go up. So there are all kinds of things that happen when you end up with a very complex development. And again, this can play out not just in the context of technology, but really if you think about a business model, the same type of thing can happen with that. It may not have anything to do with technology, but it might be, a whole new way of approaching the market and how your product or your service interacts with all of the different moving pieces, so to speak, within the business model. And it could play out in terms of system complexity. In dealing with complexity, there's this concept of control and fast response, and there are really four key elements of that response. One is that if you are dealing with a complex system, you have to be preoccupied with failure. In other words, you need to really try to get the system to fail. And to go along with that is you have to be careful when it does fail not to simplify the reasons for why something might happen. For instance, let's say you're testing multiple prototypes and for whatever reason one of them is an outlier from a performance standpoint, and you rationalize the reason for that to occur and don't really get to the root cause of that. In my experience, when you do that, it will come back to haunt you later in the project, because there's probably something that you don't understand that's gonna influence the success of the project long term. Third is the concept of resilience. When you're dealing with complex systems, the project team and the organization, this also applies to senior management and the organization in general, have to take an attitude, they have to be very resilient, which means that particularly in terms of the schedule, there can be a lot of gyrations within the project schedule, typically longer rather than shorter in my experience when you're dealing with complex systems. So there just has to be an understanding. Much of the problems that we face in organizations is this mismatch between expectations. Senior management believes one thing, the project team understands something different, and is faced with these complex systems and trying to manage them. And once there's a mismatch between really what's happening on the ground versus the perception of how the project should go, then there can be a problem. So the organization in dealing with complex developments has to be very resilient at the project team level and at the senior management level. And finally, you really need to defer to your expertise. Your senior level folks within the organization, people that have dealt with complexity before, are your best hope of understanding where it's coming from and how to deal with it. So these are the four components of how to respond to complex systems. This third part of uncertainty that leads to risk is this concept of unknown unknowns, or what we call unforeseeable uncertainty. And this graphic, I think, makes the point. A lot of things that we do within our projects, they're very well known. We know what tasks we have to do. It's just a matter of figuring out, looking at the critical path, plowing through the tasks, managing the variation, and that kind of thing. So that's the known within the project. Then you've got the known unknown, This is the foreseeable uncertainty. These are things that you can anticipate, that you can manage. But then there's this whole category of unknown unknowns. These are things you don't know at this point that you don't know, and these are the most difficult to manage. It can be related. Unknown unknowns can be related to the product technology. It can be related to the manufacturing processes. It can even be related to the market. At the business level or business model level. So it can be all through the development, not just at the technology level. It's really fundamental and novel and radical projects. I mean, that's just almost by definition. When you're dealing with really new to the world type of things that have never been done before, then you're likely going to have a lot of unknown unknowns within that development. And really, it's part of all projects, in my experience, to some degree. And remember, in that first category we talked about, it can be embedded in that concept of residual risk. It really comes down to how much influence do the unknown unknowns give rise to in terms of the risk within the project. If it dominates the projects, then it's going to be difficult to manage. Complexity in and of itself can lead to unknowns. In many times, complex systems, you just don't know how all the subsystems are going to interact with one another. In my experience, this is particularly true in the software development world when you layer on software with electromechanical systems and you're integrating systems. You just don't know how the system's going to respond, and until you start testing it and understanding where those things and peeling away the onion, so to speak, to figure out what's causing what. So it can be very, very tied. Unknown unknowns can be tied to this concept of complexity. The bottom line is, if unknown unknowns dominate the project, you really have no project plan. I mean, you can have a plan, but the next day it's out of date. So if you've got a project that's dominated by unknown unknowns and you start off trying to, really micromanage it with a high granularity Gantt chart, you're probably wasting your time. You really should be focused on what is it that you don't know and how can you learn it as quickly as possible. And we're going to talk about some of those methods to manage that type of risk. So, the bottom line is some of these standard project management tools like Gantt charts, they just don't work when a project is dominated by unknown unknowns. And it's very important from a cultural standpoint that the organization understands what this type of uncertainty means in the context of managing projects and expectations about the schedules and so forth. So as much as anything, it's also an organizational issue to understand what these kind of projects and what this kind of uncertainty really means in the context of risk to new product development. Now, there are two really classic ways that we deal with unknown unknowns, and those two methods are the iterate and learn method and parallel trials. In the iterate and learn method, you come up with a plan, you test it, you learn from it, and then you do the next test, and you keep going through these iterate and learn cycles in this solution space. This concept is really the basis of all of the lean methodologies. The fail fast and fail cheap mentality. And the lean methodologies, whether it's applied in the manufacturing processes or whether it's applied in new product development, this concept of iterate and learn is well founded. It's not a new technique. It might be called something differently, and things like Scrum and Agile in the software world and the lean methodologies, lean manufacturing, all those kind of things are really fundamentally based on this age-old classic iterate and learn cycle, which is how we can fundamentally deal with unknown unknowns. The other concept is parallel trials. So rather than doing this in an iterative fashion, you run multiple experiments in parallel. Of course, the advantage is time. You can learn a lot faster, but the downside is resources. So you typically don't see this as much, especially in small to mid-sized companies, just because of the resources required to do this. So we're going to come back to these two methodologies a little bit later on in the tools section, but I wanted to at least introduce you to this concept that these really are ways that we deal with unknown unknowns. In terms of diagnosing complexity and uncertainty in general, it's really the most difficult part of the process in my experience. And really, at best, you're probably left with a fairly qualitative type of assessment in most cases, and you really have to require on competent project managers to really assess the uncertainty in the project. You know, a project manager that's used to dealing with only task variation is suddenly they're faced with a project with a lot of unknown unknowns. It's not going to be, you know, instantaneous ability for that project manager to manage that kind of a project. It takes building up organizational muscle, so to speak, to manage all different types of projects, and every project is different. No two projects are the same. There is a suggested process. You know, it's important that you take the project and you break it into some logical pieces. It might be based on the modules within the development or the tasks or sub-projects, but you have to break it apart in some way and then look at each of those pieces and assess where the uncertainty may come from. And they may be different, and so you have to manage each piece in parallel based on the type of uncertainty. You know, if you have a development with, for instance, multiple subsystems and sub-projects, your one subsystem may be an incremental, you know, change of something that exists already. So that's primarily going to be task variation. It's probably not a lot of unknown unknowns in that type of development or that piece of the development. But another subsystem may be all new. And so that's a much different level of uncertainty for that subsystem. So not every subtask within the project is going to have the same risk profile, and you have to understand that and figure out how to manage it. And then you have to also remember, to go along with that, that the sources of uncertainty will change as the project progresses. So, you know, you might start out with a lot of unknown unknowns at the beginning of the project, but as it unfolds, eventually it'll morph to strictly task variation. You know, if you're going to go to market, eventually every project will end up on a Gantt chart with task variation. You know what you got to do, you just got to get it done. But at the beginning of the project, that may not be true. So you just have to understand that as well, that there's a time factor here. It's not just a matter of looking at risk on individual sub-projects, but it's also a matter of thinking about how risk will change as a function of time as the project unfolds. Okay, so as I mentioned, I want you to think at a kind of a higher level when it relates to those kind of three categories of uncertainty, and it can be applied not just to the you know, to the technical risk and the schedule risk, but really at a higher level. And it's those categories of uncertainty that leads to risk in projects. And now let's move into tools that we can use to manage and mitigate risk. And there are a number of different things that we're going to talk about today. We're only going to get through the first three sets of tools here, and then part two we'll carry on with these last two, and we'll spend a lot of time on those. But I want to cover these first three for the rest of the time that we have today. And the first is to introduce you to this concept of the risk matrix, which is really a generalized approach to thinking about risk management and mitigation. And this really pulls together some of the things that we talked about in the previous section on sources of uncertainty in a very nice framework that is a good place to start at the beginning of the project. Then you can use it throughout the entire project. And again, I want you to think at a little bit higher level. This is not just about technology. This could be applied to a business model. It can be applied to several different in several different ways within your development. So think of it a little bit more broadly. Down in the x-axis here of this matrix are the sources of uncertainty that we talked about. Right, so we've got task variation, we've got foreseeable events, and we've got unforeseeable uncertainty, or what we call unknown unknowns. And then on the y-axis here is complexity, from low complexity systems to high complexity systems. So depending on where you are in this risk matrix will help you understand the types of tools that you're ultimately going to have to use for either that piece of the project or the project in total. So for instance, if you're faced mostly with task variation, then kind of these classic project management tools, Gantt charts and critical chain with project buffers and things like that, they work very, very well. If you've got on top of that the normal foreseeable uncertainty, then you move into what we call risk lists. So you can add that on as a tool. But if you're up in this quadrant, in other words, you've got a lot of unknown unknowns, and it's a very complex system, you may have to, in addition to maybe your classic tools that you use for pieces of the project, you might have to add other tools, particularly this concept of iterate and learn and parallel trials, or some combination of that. So, and also remember again that complexity in and of itself can lead to unknown unknowns. So you have to understand, if you're up in this quadrant here, rushing to do a Gantt chart is just not appropriate, and will not be a waste of time basically. So you really have to kind of start here with this risk management framework and think about your project. And again, to reiterate, it's not just, you don't just look at this at the project in total, but you got to look at it in the context of the individual sub-projects. However it makes sense to break down the development, you have to think about it. And again, it might be related to the market, might be related to technology, it can be anywhere within the project. And then secondly, this risk profile will change as the project unfolds, and you have to accommodate that. So it's a very dynamic situation. But I think this is where you really need to start. I think in my experience, if you've attended other webinars within this series, you've seen this risk matrix before. I use it a lot with clients as a good framework to think about risk and new product development, and how every project is different and you have to manage each project individually. Okay, secondly now I want to talk about some qualitative tools to manage risk, and this is really related to these concept of risk lists and thinking about foreseeable uncertainty. So we'll talk about this broad-based qualitative tool first, and this is really this concept of what we call trigger list or risk lists as a way to manage foreseeable uncertainty. So step one in this qualitative assessment is to create these kind of risk lists or trigger lists. And this is an example. In this case, it's broken down into 4 different columns, 4 different subsets: market risk, technical risk, schedule risk, cost and quality. And for each one of those listed out are some typical things that you could potentially use in your business to at least have a discussion. This is really something that the project team needs to sit down and go through this exercise and come up with these lists. So each one of these proposes some typical ones that you might use to get the discussion started, but you're going to find in any individual development that you may come up with others. And you might even have other types of categories that you might want to focus on. So that's the first step, is to create this list, and it's a really good team effort. It's not something that somebody just sits down, one person in the project. It's really best done at the beginning of the project. It's really one of the first steps that you're going to do when you start thinking about the project and developing the schedule and how you're going to manage the project. This is really an upfront type of exercise right after you kind of have considered that risk list, and actually, the risk matrix, and actually this will help you kind of pick out where you might be in the project in terms of within that risk matrix. This is a really good resource. I've referenced this resource before in the past. It has a nice section on trigger list or risk list in new product development. So that's step one. Step two now is you look at each one of those that you came up with and you score them on two factors. One is impact to the project on a scale of 1 to 5, so 1 being really no significant impact to the project, to 5 considered a project killer. If this happens to the project, it can kill the project. So that's the first thing, is the impact. Secondly is the probability that that will occur. From 1, not worth considering, to 5, it's almost certain to occur. Okay, so these are the two factors that you score each one of those on. And again, this is something that is best done within the context of a team activity. And then once you do that, you can average all that data together and come up with this type of a list where you list out all these potential risks to the project, and you've got your two scores, your probability of occurrence and the impact of the project. You can multiply those two numbers together to get this ranking. And you can rank order all of these potential risks to the project. And so it's just an excellent way to look at the project and ferret out where the risks are and where you need to spend time, and kind of where each one of these are in the context of that risk matrix, and how you're going to manage that particular risk within the project. So again, this is a very powerful, quick way to look at the project risks, at least from the standpoint of foreseeable uncertainty. Now, there might be some things that happen here that that will lead you to say, that it's really, you don't really understand a particular issue, and that might point you in the direction that really this is an unknown, and then we're going to manage that a little bit differently. So this is a very powerful way. You can use these rankings now to really focus the team on particular aspects of the risk. And you'll note here that there might be some of the risks that are very high impact to the project, but very low likelihood that they will occur. So in relative to the other risks, they're actually not that great. But I think sometimes, without doing this type of exercise, engineers especially would typically want to key in on high impact types of risks. But if it's just not that likely to occur, then you're probably wasting resources. It might be a good academic exercise, but there might be some other things that you really want to spend time on to begin with. So I want to talk now about this another technique, which is kind of builds on the discussion that we just had, but it's a little bit more rigorous methodology. It's called failure mode and effect analysis, FMEA. It's a very powerful technique. It's been around many years. It's heavily used in the auto industry, for instance. You may be familiar with it. If you're not, this will introduce it to you. But it's a it's a little bit more rigorous methodology in terms of these risk lists that we just talked about. In FMEA, it can be done at the system level. It can be done at a particular product level or a process. You really can apply it very, very broadly. This is a good resource. There are a lot of good resources out there about FMEA. It's been around so long, but this is I like this resource. It's an easy read. It's got a lot of great examples, so I recommend it highly. But the concept in FMEA, and it may be driven off of that first risk assessment tool that we just talked about. There might be aspects of the development then that you want to go a little bit further and do an FMEA on. And the way that this would work, let's describe it in the context of a product development. You would go through and list separate subsystems. For instance, a description might be a wiring harness within the new product, and you brainstorm all the potential failure modes for that wire harness. For instance, there might be a bad solder joint, or a crimp in the wire, or you could brainstorm all different types of modes of failure for that wire harness. And then for each of those failure modes, you brainstorm what the effects of that failure would be. For instance, might be a shock hazard, for instance, or it might just be, or it might be a performance issue. It might degrade performance, or it might be an aesthetic effect. So you go through each of those failure modes and look at particular effects, and there may be multiple effects for a single failure. And then for each one of those, you go through root causes. What is exactly the root cause? Is it a vendor issue? Is it a poor product coming from the vendor? Is an assembly issue? So you can go through and brainstorm the root causes. And then for each one in this list now, and you can see how quickly it can expand, you go and you rate it on 3 different factors, similar to that risk list that we just talked about. You rate it on the severity, usually on a score of 1 to 10, on the probability of occurrence, again on a scale of 1 to 10, and your ability to detect that failure, again on a scale of 1 to 10. So you go through that. So potentially when you multiply those 3 together, the maximum score is 1,000. But again, it's a powerful way now to go through each one of these and look at the total risk number and figure out how you're going to address that risk. So the RPN number will help prioritize where the project team needs to spend their time. And through these ratings here, you can, you might focus on the severity, you might focus on the probability of occurrence, or you might focus on your ability to detect the failure. So it really is a powerful way to break down each of these failure modes and come up with, with specific things that you're going to do in order to mitigate that risk. And then this right-hand section is strictly a matter of tracking how it changes. So this is something that you would do. You'd assign people to start working on particular issues, and then you look at re-rating these results. Again, this is best done in the context of a team effort rather than relying on one single person. There's too much bias when you're using these types of risk lists, too much bias if you rely on just one person to do this. So it's really much more powerful technique when you're doing it in the context of a team. And there's also a big benefit in doing these 2 types of tools in a team environment. It really builds consensus around what the issues are. And as I will point out in many cases for these types of processes, it's really the piece of paper that you generate is not as important as the process that you go through within the team in order to develop this information. That's the real power of these types of tools. Okay, when you're really in terms of FMEA and risk lists in general, there's, I think typically how projects unfold typically is that you start with a project, you have some kind of basic design, maybe a block diagram. From this, you might develop a very high-level Gantt chart just to kind of get a feel for what the schedule looks like. But then you're going to start, within the team, using FMEA and these other risk lists in order to really understand where the risks are and start to pull those things apart and understand how you're going to manage the project. That all gets fed back into the schedule because that will lead to other types of tasks and things that have to be done. And then you're going to basically, that will feed in to using that as an input along with your expertise to start trying to ferret out, do you have unknown unknowns, and what do you need to learn, and how are you going to learn it as quickly as possible? And we're going to deal with some of these tools as well. And again, that feeds back into the schedule. So this is an iterative, ongoing process within the project. It really never ends until the project comes to market. You're always kind of peeling away the layers of the onion. You start at a high level, and then you start working your way down through the things that are important to you in terms of to the project. Okay, so we talked about some qualitative ways to look at to understanding business risk, which includes, again, the technical and the schedule risk. Now let's talk about a quantitative way to look at that as well. And this is a tool called NPD Risk Assessor. It's an online tool. It has 2 components. There's a qualitative component. Really, it's similar to what you would do with risk lists and team brainstorming about what the issues are. So really the qualitative component are those qualitative risk lists and so forth that we just got done talking about. But this technique also has a quantitative component, and that's based on a statistical model from a very large number of new product development successes and failure. And basically from this model, out of this analysis of this data came 30 plus factors that are really correlated to the success or failure of the project based on this data. And these 30 or so factors map onto 9 key influencers that drive the project towards success or failure. So this quantitative model provides insight on these 9 key influencers and helps to pull apart where the risk is in the project. And it's not just about technology, it's about you know, do you have enough funding within the project? Do you have the right people? And the way that this is done is that each team member gets a survey tool that includes these 30 different factors, and each of these statements, every team member rates them on a scale of 1 to 10 for how closely they agree with that statement on a scale of 1 to 10, and how sure they are of their response on a scale of 1 to 10. And so, for instance, one factor might be we have enough people in this project to complete the project on time. And each team member rates their agreement to that statement on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being that they agree totally with that statement, 1 that they don't agree with it, and then they rate it on a second factor and how sure they are about that. Somebody that's intimately involved with the project might be very sure about their answer, whereas somebody from marketing, they think they know, but they're not really that sure. So that's how it plays out. So everybody in the team scores these 30 factors on those 30 statements on those 2 factors, and then it all goes into this model. And you can get a lot out of it. This is just one type of data. So you see here, these are the 9 key influencers around the arms of this radar chart, and you can see the different key influencers. And then basically each one of these, in this case, is rated on a score of 0 to 100. So anything that's showing up as above 50 is based on that statistical model pushing that project closer to success, and anything that's less than 50 is pushing that project closer to failure based on this statistical model. So in this case, something related to those factors associated with the competitive situation is leading the project manager and senior management to look at this and say something about the competitive situation we are just not comfortable with. So you might just not understand the competition, and so this is you can just already see how powerful of a tool this is to start pulling apart where the risks are in terms of the overall risk to the business. This is not just about the technology, it's about will this product be successful when it gets to the market. So just one example. There are other things that come out of this model, but it's a powerful way to quantitatively look at risk within new product development. And again, as much as the data that comes out of this, the power of this in terms of the team activity is a really big part of the advantage of doing this this type of risk assessment within your project. Okay, so the last 2 sections in terms of tools that can be used for managing and mitigating complexity and unknown unknowns, and the concept of picking project management tools that are appropriate for the risk in the project. These are 2 topics that we're going to come back to in part 2 of this webinar. So I want to thank you for attending today, and I look forward to your participation in the next webinar. Have a great day.